All right, guys, in chapter 20, we'll be looking at the lymphatic system. Let's start by looking at some of the main functions of the system. One of the primary functions of lymphatic system is fluid balance. It's a way that the interstitial fluid, or the fluid that's outside of a vessel in your tissues, re-enters circulation. And so if you think about any time you get any kind of inflammation or swelling somewhere, that fluid has escaped out of the vessels into the tissues, and you need to get that fluid back into circulation. And so that's one of the main functions that we'll see here for the lymphatic system. Another function is fat absorption. There are specialized types of lymphatic vessels or capillaries called lacteals, and these are located in the intestines, and they help to absorb some lipids or fats into the lymphatic system, which eventually get into the bloodstream. And then another major function really is defense, or your immune system. And so we'll be talking about the immune system in a second video, but that's how your body protects itself from invading microbes, microorganisms, maybe viruses, bacteria, or some type of foreign substance or toxin. So let's first kind of talk about the anatomy of the lymphatic system and a little bit about the fluid balance and returning that fluid back to circulation. And so in this diagram, you see some of the major parts of the lymphatic system, including the lymphatic fluid, which is called lymph fluid. Lymph fluid is essentially plasma from the blood vessels that has leaked out into the tissues. It has come out into the tissues, and that lymph fluid now needs to be returned back into circulation. So to help that happen, you have lymphatic vessels, and we'll talk about that in this video. There's different sizes and types of lymphatic vessels, and some of their characteristics we'll look at. You have collections of lymphatic tissue, lymph nodes, which everybody's heard of, I'm sure, and then you also have some lymphatic organs, including tonsils, the spleen, and the thymus gland. The thymus gland we talked briefly about in chapter 16, because it is part of the endocrine system as well. It does produce a hormone, and so we'll revisit the thymus briefly in this chapter as well. So let's start by looking at, again, some of the anatomy here. We'll start by looking at the lymphatic vessels. One thing to note about lymphatic vessels is they're always carrying lymph fluid away from the tissues. They're draining the lymph fluid from the tissues, trying to get that lymph fluid back into circulation. And so the goal is to get that fluid back up to the heart. And so it does that through a series of lymphatic vessels. The smallest of these vessels are called capillaries. Just like you have blood capillaries, you also have lymphatic capillaries. They're very similar to blood capillaries. They suggest they're a little bit more permeable to diffusion, and to allow more fluid to enter into those capillaries than even blood capillaries would be. So they're there to really absorb fluid. And you kind of see in the picture here, you have an example of a lymphatic capillary, and it has large openings between the cells. That allows a lot of this extra fluid, which we call lymph. Once it enters into the capillary, it's referred to as lymph fluid, to be able to come into the capillary system and then make its way back to the heart. It does have kind of overlapping epithelial cell membranes, the edges of the cells, and that kind of helps it have a valve system really in place, because everything's moving in one direction. Now we're kind of going up in size, and so the second type of lymphatic vessel we'll see is just called a lymphatic vessel. These are very similar to veins, and they also have valves, and that allows that that lymph fluid only travels in one direction. The other thing about lymph vessels is that along the route of lymph vessels, you find lymphatic nodes or lymph nodes. And these are collections, I'll show you this in a few minutes, but these are collections of lymphatic tissue. You've got lots of white blood cells there, and they're there to filter out the lymph fluid. In fact, this is the only filter mechanism in place for that lymphatic fluid as it's going through the lymph vessels. Then number 3 in order here, the lymphatic trunks. These are larger vessels, and this is where lymphatic vessels are all draining into. And so there's a total of 9 of these. Some of these are duplicated. So for example, you have 2 jugular trunks and 2 subclavian trunks. And so some of these are, you've got multiple branches of these. And so the jugular trunks are draining the lymph fluid anywhere from the head and the neck. Just like you have jugular vessels in the neck, you have, or jugular veins, and you have jugular lymphatic vessels, and that's draining the lymph fluid down from the head and the neck region. Subclavian, the word means, underneath the clavicle. And so their job is to drain any of the lymphatic vessels, the lymph from the lymphatic vessels in those areas from the upper limbs. Bronchomediastinal, this is in the chest cavity. And so this is draining anything in the thoracic or the chest cavity. The intestinal, draining the abdominal organs, and then the lumbar vessels or lumbar trunks are draining the vessels from the lower limb areas. And then the last of the lymphatic vessels is what's called a lymphatic duct. And this is where all of those trunks feed into. So everything's feeding back into a larger and larger funnel-like system, I guess. And so all of these lymphatic vessels and lymphatic duct trunks are all feeding into these lymphatic ducts. And so there's really two different types. You have a right lymphatic duct, and you have a thoracic duct that's trying to drain all of these lymphatic trunks into one area. So if you take a look at the diagram here, of course, here is kind of a faded picture of the heart. Here you have your superior vena cava coming down to the right atrium. And then all of the vessels that you see, the green shaded vessels, these are lymphatic vessels, and they're all returning lymph fluid back, trying to get it back into the superior vena cava. And to do that, what happens is you see a thoracic duct here, and it's kind of in between of two of the main veins, the left internal jugular vein, the left subclavian vein on the left side. And so here's a thoracic duct that's draining the left side of the body. And all of this fluid is kind of going, the lymph fluid is kind of going into this little notch region, this fork region here, and that's going to eventually come down into the superior vena cava. And then it kind of does a similar scenario on the right side. So the right side is kind of doing a similar thing. These are going into in between this right jugular and this right subclavian vein here. Now, the lymphatic tissue that you find throughout the body is really composed of two main things. It has lymphocytes. It's got white blood cells. These are your T and your B lymphocytes, like we've talked about before. And also has a collection of phagocytic type cells, macrophages, large white blood cells that are phagocytic. It also has dendritic cells. These are antigen presenting cells, and we'll talk about that term a little later when we get to the immune section. But these are cells that help to activate your T cells and your B cells. And they do have some phagocytic type activity as well. The other thing that you find in lymphatic tissue is a special type of collagen fibers. You may remember this back from 169 in the tissue chapter. When you looked at collagen, there's actually two different types. One type of collagen fibers is what's called reticular fibers. These are just very fine threads of protein fibers, and they're very tightly packed, and they're kind of like a cross network of fibers, and that really act as a filter. So they help to trap in particles, microorganisms, broken down cells, old cell debris, those types of things. It's kind of like a filter that you would have in your house or something that kind of traps air particles or dust in the air or something like that. That's what this is doing. It's trapping particles as it's being flowed, as the lymph fluid flows through it. And places you find lymphatic tissues, some places that you'll find it are like your lymph nodes, your spleen, your thymus. Some places, some of these organs are encapsulated. That just means they have a connective tissue capsule wrapped around them for protection. And then some areas are more diffuse. They're non-encapsulated. They don't have that layer of connective tissue on the outside. And a good example is something called MALT, M-A-L-T. And MALT stands for mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. This is lymphatic tissue that's associated with mucous membranes. So the places that you generally find mucous membranes, you usually find this type of lymphatic tissue. So for example, in your mouth, you'll have mucous membranes there, kind of line the mouth and the oral cavity, and so you're going to find tonsils there. Peyer's patches, these are specialized types of lymphatic tissue that's found in the intestines. Your appendix has some malt associated with it. Your respiratory tract, your urinary tract, all of these that have mucous membranes also will have this type of malt or lymphatic tissue associated with it. Now let's take a look at some of the lymphatic organs and see what we can determine about some of these. Tonsils, these are relatively large groups of lymphatic tissue that's kind of collected together that form an organ. And you find that, these are found in the oral cavity. Most everybody's familiar with tonsils, but what you may not realize is you actually have 3 different types, and they kind of encircle the mouth or the oral cavity to try to provide protection from microorganisms or toxins or something in the mouth. And so these are grouped together into 3 main groups. What we normally hear people talking about as a tonsil is probably referred to as just the palatine tonsils. We just call these the tonsils. They're the palatine tonsils, and they're kind of on the sides in the back of the mouth area. There's actually a lingual tonsil on the posterior section, the back section of the tongue. And sometimes if you have a cold virus or you're sick, then you may see these lingual tonsils kind of swell up, kind of get puffy on the back of the tongue. And then if you've heard of the adenoids, the anatomical term for the adenoids are the pharyngeal tonsils, and that's because they're located in the pharynx, in the back. The diagram, what it does is it takes away the upper palate here, and there would be the little structure here called the uvula, kind of hangs down in the back of the throat, and the pharynx, and they've taken that away because that pharynx or the pharyngeal tonsil is located behind that structure there. You also have lymph nodes as part of your lymphatic tissue, and I mentioned earlier that these are filtering lymph fluid, and so they're going to be found connected to lymphatic vessels. And they have a cortex section and a middle section called the medulla, where they have lots of white blood cells and lymphatic tissue, the collagen fibers there for filtration. They have vessels coming into the lymph node, and those are afferent. That means they're going toward a structure, and you have vessel coming out called an efferent vessel that's exiting the structure. And like I mentioned before, you have phagocytes that are there, and then you have dendritic cells that help to stimulate the process or activate your T cells and your B cell response. Sometimes you do find individuals that have cancer that metastasizes. It moves, it spreads, it may get to the lymph node. Sometimes it does get trapped in the lymph node. Sometimes your immune system can kind of take care of that. Those types of tumor cells or cancer cells there, but many times they will get trapped in a lymph node and begin to grow from there, and perhaps even migrate out of the lymph nodes. Now, the spleen is another lymphatic organ we need to talk about. Anatomically, it's located in the left upper quadrant of the abdomen. It does happen to be the largest of the lymphatic organs, and it is also a filter. It contains the same type of lymphatic tissue that we saw earlier. It has the collagen fibers, it's got lymphocytes, it's got T cells, B cells, the dendritic cells are there. The tissue, though, looks a little different. When you look into this at a microscope, you see kind of a reddish area and a whitish area tissue. This is called red pulp and white pulp. The red pulp here has one of the things that the red pulp tissue does is to break down old and dying red blood cells, erythrocytes. And so once the red blood cells make their way into the spleen, if they're older, red blood cells only last 3 or 4 months in circulation, then they start kind of losing their shape. And when that happens, they get stuck inside the spleen filters them out, and then in the red pulp area, you've got lots of macrophages that will come down and break down those red blood cells. The white pulp area is just your normal type of filter that's just breaking down your bacteria or your virus-infected cells, different pathogens. So here's a couple of functions for the spleen. It does destroy defective red blood cells, erythrocytes. It does have the ability to initiate an immune response. It can detect a foreign substance, a foreign, a bacteria cell or a virus infected cell, and try to begin an immune reaction against that. And it does have a small reservoir for blood, and so it does kind of hold on to some blood volume there. Then lastly, we'll look at the thymus gland. You may remember some of this from the first chapter, chapter 16, because the thymus gland is part of the endocrine system because it does produce a hormone. It is located in the chest cavity in the region, the middle region there called the mediastinum. It's kind of strange how it grows. It does grow very quickly when you're young. During your first year of development, this grows very quickly, and then it pretty much stays the same. But then once you turn, in your 50s and 60s, it starts to decrease in size. Actually, starts to get smaller. Now, the function of the thymus again is to secrete a hormone called thymosin, and this is where T cells, T lymphocytes, go to finish the developmental process. And we'll talk about that process in a little bit later in the chapter.